Lord Turner, welcome to Economist Impact Sustainability Week.
Thank you.
This is our ninth version of this week. We'll be hosting the 10th one next year. Can you tell me a little bit about how you've seen the energy transition shift over those 10 years?
Well, I think actually there have been some very big shifts. First of all, the level of ambition. It's an ambition we may not meet, but I remember that 10 years ago, almost nobody was talking about trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The aim was well below 2 degrees centigrade. So at least we've got an attempted greater ambition. It's also true that there's been a major step forward in the ambition of companies. 10 years ago, there were almost no major companies in the world which had made commitments to be net zero emissions by 2050. But now, across all the sectors, even what we sometimes call the hard to abate sectors, steel and cement, shipping and aviation, major companies across the world committed to get to net zero by 2050. And then the third thing that's changed is a radical fall in the cost of some of the crucial technologies. I'm thinking in particular of solar PV, wind turbines come down, not quite as much as solar PV, but pretty fast, and of course batteries and electric vehicles. Put all that together, and I think, although I don't think we will limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, I think we're on a better path to limit it well below 2 degrees centigrade, which is what people were talking about 10 years ago. And all this reflects, I think, the success of the process that was launched at Paris, which depends on an interesting self-reinforcing loop between politicians and governments make commitments to targets or objectives. Companies feel that they ought to respond to that. The very fact that companies respond to it drives the technology innovation that makes it possible for them to meet their targets at lower cost. And the observation that companies are setting stretching targets and the costs are coming down increase the willingness of governments, policymakers, to set stretching targets. It's a complicated self-reinforcing process, but on the whole, it has moved in a positive direction over the last 9 years.
You mentioned setting these targets. Obviously, implementing the change necessary to get to those targets can be very complicated. What do you see for some of the companies that might be part of your coalition at the Energy Transition Commission? What do you see some of the greatest impediments that they have to meeting those targets or achieving those targets?
Well, it depends sector by sector. So within the Energy Transition Commission, we have many major companies involved in the power sectors of the world, whether they be in India or in Europe, the UK, US, etc. And the good news is that those companies know that you can put in place solar and wind and produce kilowatt hours of electricity now at a lower cost often than fossil fuels. That is the cost reduction that's occurred. And that is, on the basis of that, in Europe and the US, we have set very stretching targets that we will get the whole power system to net zero by 2035, 15 years before we try to get the whole economy to net zero by 2050. But once you've set that target, even though we have the technologies of generation available, there's a lot of enabling factors. Grids are very important. Investing in the grids, which are required to support higher levels of electrification and to move renewables from new sources of generation, investments in distribution grids to enable people to run heat pumps or charge electric vehicles, higher loads per household and per street. And there's also in the power sector a big challenge about how we're going to balance this system. And we know there are technologies becoming available, batteries, hydrogen, but how exactly it all fits together and how we play demand management to discourage people from all trying to use electricity at the same time, that's the complexity which still remains, even though the fundamental vision, we can produce kilowatt hours cheaper with renewables, that bit is clear. And then you get other sectors where a lot of the challenges are about the pace at which you can change over the capital stock. So most of the major steel companies of the world, the major shipping companies of the world, the major cement companies know the technologies which can get them to net zero. And if they were building their industries for the first time, we'd probably have net zero steel and cement and shipping by 2035, because all the new capital assets we'd buy would be the new ones, ships that burn ammonia or methanol, steel mills that use hydrogen as the reduction agent rather than coking coal. But because you've got all your capital assets to start with, because some of them have been paid for, they've invested, but they've still got many years to run, there's a problem of just how fast you can turn over a capital stock. And even once you've made that net zero commitment for 2050, how fast you can drive it down is a major challenge and requires a lot of public policy support. So different challenges in different sectors that our members are involved in.
You talked about the solutions for these hard to abate sectors such as cement and steel, and the role of hydrogen that you mentioned. Green molecules can come in many forms, but particularly green hydrogen will take massive amounts of renewable energy. Do you think it's sort of hype, or do you think that green hydrogen economy is something that can be built as fast as some are hoping?
Well, look, at the Energy Transition Commission, we have been bulls on the eventual development of green hydrogen, but with two things that I think have distinguished us from other people. First, we have never thought that hydrogen would play any appreciable role whatsoever in passenger cars. I think that was a delusion. And we now think that hydrogen may play only a relatively small role even in commercial vehicles, commercial road transport, because increasingly battery electric trucks are looking more and more competitive with a hydrogen fuel cell trucks. There may still be a role for hydrogen fuel cell trucks in the very, very big trucks, but it's squeezing down. And we always believe that, and so there are some people who believe there would be a big role for hydrogen in those sectors. Hasn't surprised us, there's a disappointment. The sectors where we think hydrogen will play a major role are steel, as an input to a synthetic sustainable aviation fuel, as an input to ammonia or methanol for shipping. But again, we've always believed that the really big takeoff of that demand would occur from 2030 onwards, because it simply takes time to invest in the assets to make the changeover. So at one level, I think there was a hype and people said, look, there's 100 million tons of hydrogen used in the world today. We were producing forecasts of 400, 500, 600 million by 2050. But in 2030, we still thought it would only be 120 million tons. We thought the big ramp up would come later. And I think some people, failed to realize that. They took the story of there's a big long-term role for hydrogen and then thought, okay, it's going to happen immediately. And it was never going to happen immediately. The big opportunities for green hydrogen over the next 5 years are where we are using grey hydrogen today. It's in oil refining, it's in natural gas upstream processing, and it's in producing ammonia for the fertilizer industry. That's where, if we have commitments from the oil and gas companies to drive down their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, that's where, if we have mandates that require zero carbon fertilizer or carbon prices, that's where you'll see green hydrogen demand in the short term. Only later can we expect to see it ending up as big figures in global shipping, global aviation, and global steel.
So it really seems there's a big role for those commitments and also the national targets that you mentioned at the beginning. We've just finished COP28 in December in Dubai. There were some very interesting sort of commitments that national governments made there around things like renewable energy and energy efficiency. Can you talk a little bit about what you expect to be the implications of those commitments for industry?
Well, it's interesting. At one level, you can be a cynic and you say, we have these declarations at COPs, at COP26 in Glasgow, COP28 in Dubai. Do they achieve anything? They're very high level, but they do sort of achieve something. The tripling of renewables commitment at COP28 at one level was an odd one, because it wasn't the case that all countries of the world committed to tripling their renewables. All of them committed to making a contribution to a tripling of global renewables from around 3.5 terawatts of capacity today to about 11 terawatts by 2030. But the fact that they've done so now means that across the whole world, people are saying, okay, well, I did make that commitment of COP, but what should be my national target that goes into my national determined contribution, which will have to be submitted by next year ahead of COP30? And we are seeing that the very fact that that commitment was made is then energizing individual countries to say, okay, I'm going to set a target which is consistent with the global target. We know where the biggest target will be. I mean, China will have 2,700 gigawatts, 2.7 terawatts of renewables by 2030, perhaps higher. So that's a big chunk of it. India has a target of 500 gigawatts, but there's other countries with huge amounts of solar resource which have minute targets at the moment. And one of the most extreme ones is Indonesia, where the disconnect between the target that they've set, which I think is the sum total of 5 gigawatts by 2030, and the enormous potential. But the fact that they made that commitment will get people looking at it, and it also means that it creates confidence for the solar PV manufacturers and the wind turbine manufacturers who invest in the capacity, which brings down the cost, which makes it possible to meet those targets at lower cost. So I think the tripling of renewables was important. There was also a commitment to transition away from fossil fuels. And again, you can be a cynic and say, well, transition away, what does that mean? By when? How fast? But it was actually the first time that we'd actually had a commitment of the COP that we are going to reduce the use of all fossil fuels, not just steel, not just coal, which was committed at COP26. And it did say transition away from fossil fuels in a fashion which is compatible with a 1.5 degree centigrade limit. Well, we know from the scenarios that the IEA has put out and that we at the Energy Transition Commission have put out what that means. That means we're going to have to reduce fossil fuel use by order of magnitude 80% by 2050. There's no way we can otherwise limit global warming to even 1.7 degrees centigrade, not alone 1.5. And all these declarative commitments, they do change the way people think about the world, and then it produces people think about the world in a different way, they act in a different way, that changes the costs, it changes the technological possibilities, and we're able to meet the targets. It's a hugely imperfect process, but if you ask yourself, you get 190 countries of the world, independent countries, get together at a COP. There is no global government, there is no enforcement system. What would you expect would come out? You'd expect nothing. Frankly, it's amazing.
And anything seems a miracle.
It's amazing that it agrees on anything. And these agreements, I think, particularly at COP21 in Paris, some of the agreements at COP26 in Glasgow, and here at COP28, I think they do, in an imperfect world, nudge us forward towards this energy transition.
Well, there was this big debate in Dubai about, you mentioned the moving away, phasing away from fossil fuels, rather as opposed to phasing out fossil fuels. Do you think that fossil fuels have an important role to play in the energy transition going forward?
Well, look, they clearly have an important role in transition. I mean, we couldn't stand up tomorrow and say we're going to have no fossil fuels tomorrow, or even no fossil fuels by 2030. The most you can achieve by 2030 is maybe a 30% reduction in coal, a 20% reduction in oil or gas. That's the sort of order of magnitude which is in the range of possibility, and then you decrease it there on it. I think the interesting thing is, what is the role of fossil fuels in the long term? At the Energy Transition Commission, we talked about a world where if we really wanted to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, we would need to, and we could, reduce the use of oil by 90 or even 95% by 2050, coal 90% by 2050, gas maybe 70% by 2050, and even more beyond that, because you have to say, what do we eventually need fossil fuels for? Actually, in almost every sector of the economy, there are alternatives, and in the long term, there will be better alternatives. We don't need them for the road transport sector, because electric vehicles and hydrogen will be a better alternative. Better for the planet, in the case of battery electric, passenger cars, better economically, better for local pollution. The internal combustion engine is dead, we just haven't buried it. It's going, and anybody in the oil industry who doesn't think it's going isn't paying attention to the technological trends. We have the ability to electrify all sorts of medium temperature heat, the sort of stuff which is used in the brewing industry, the textile industry, pulp and paper industry, heat between 100 degrees centigrade and 400 degrees centigrade. It'll take time to electrify that, because at the moment you've got factories which have been set up, the whole way that the piping works is round a gas boiler. You can't leap away from that. Changing a factory involves downtime as you retrofit it, so inevitably it takes time. But I think we'll get to 2050 or 2060 and almost all of that sort of heat will be done with electricity rather than with gas. Even the high temperature heats, we're getting more and more opportunities to use electricity in various new forms. So what do we need fossil fuels for in the long term? Probably we need fossil fuels where we want a carbon atom not to burn, but to use as a carbon atom. So the sort of last holdout of the fossil fuel industry may be the petrochemical industry. It may be to make plastics, because even if we do, and we should, completely recycle all plastics at the end of life, if with a growing population the total stock of plastics in the world is increasing, you still need a new input of a feedstock, and that could be fossil fuel. So it is quite interesting. We don't need to answer these questions yet, but my rough feeling is that by 2050 or 2060 we'll reduce the use of fossil fuels by 80%, and that by 2100 we'll have reduced them 95%.
That makes sense. But as you say, in the interim, during the transition, we need to get that right. As we transition out of one fuel into another, we need to avoid things like price spikes that can lead to inflation or increase the cost of living for consumers. And that leads to this question of sort of justice. How can we maintain popular support for something like the energy transition, and what are the critical elements that we need to get right to make sure the population stays on board?
Well, look, first of all, we've got to be absolutely clear what the drivers of the cost of living crisis and gas spikes have been, because when it occurred, you did have the less responsible bits of the fossil fuel industry saying, oh, look, these huge gas prices, that's what happens when you drive an energy transition and you don't invest enough in fossil fuels. There's absolutely not a shred of evidence that that played any major role in that spike. That spike was caused because Putin invaded Ukraine. And Europe suddenly lost about 30%, 35% of its entire gas supply, which was coming from Russia. And of course, there had been lots of investment in Russian gas. It's just we didn't want to use it any longer, and he didn't want to sell it to us. So that was a crisis called within the fossil fuel industry, and a crisis, by the way, which illustrates the dangerous insecurity of a fossil fuel system, which is bound to have high amounts of trade across the world, because the allocation of fossil fuel reserves is highly unequally divided across the world. The good news about renewables is they're not equally divided. Some countries have more renewable resources than others, but they're much more evenly divided than fossil fuels. So the renewable system, once we build it, renewables and maybe nuclear as well, will be one in which there is much less trade in energy, and therefore much greater security for each country and much less vulnerability to geopolitics suddenly producing spikes in energy prices.
Do you see any role for financial mechanisms that can help pay for that upfront capital cost and make those gains in savings over the long run?
I think when you think about financing, it's completely different in different sectors of the economy. You talk about financing lots of wind, offshore wind in the North Sea, provided we get the regulatory structure right, the auctions, the planning, the permitting, that will all occur from private finance, eventually without a subsidy. Switch to the developing world, and there needs to be a major role for the multilateral development banks, because there isn't enough private finance to do that. And then if you focus, for instance, on something like residential heat in the UK, I think we've got to break the challenge down by different categories of income group. At the top end of the income distribution, we fundamentally need to push people, cajole people, and if necessary, force people to just sign the checks to do it. But maybe that's only the top 10% of the population. There's probably then 60% where really thoughtful and innovative ways of using the mortgage market to say, you've got a mortgage, if you've got a mortgage, here's a way of adding 10,000 to your mortgage at a very low cost, provided it is spent on doing your house up to a high energy efficient standard with a heat pump. And those could be sweetened and they could be made cheaper by a joint coordination between government guarantees, a bit of government subsidies, but a big role for the private sector. And then at the bottom end of the income distribution, look, this is where there is going to have to be government money. Because at the bottom end of the income distribution, you have people whose access to capital is very expensive. A lot of low-income people, what do they borrow money on? They borrow money at credit cards at 15 or 20%. Completely different from the situation of somebody at the very top end of the distribution who's probably got £15,000 in a bank account only earning 2 or 3%. So the cost of capital varies hugely between different groups of people. So we're going to have a combination of mechanisms in these different markets in the world and between different income groups and householder wealth groups within the residential heat space.
So a lot of variation, no one size fits all.
No one size fits all.
Great. Lord Turner, thanks so much for joining us here at the Economist Impact Sustainability Week. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.